It began not with a proclamation, but with a silence, an eerie, deliberate silence that fell over Kensington Palace after a meeting no one was supposed to know about. When Catherine, Princess of Wales, emerged, her composure was intact, but her eyes told a different story. Something had shifted. Something irreversible. And at the centre of it all stood Prince Edward. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The conversation itself was never meant to surface, at least not beyond the closed doors of senior advisors and carefully vetted confidants. Yet, as with all things in the House of Windsor, silence has a way of echoing louder than any official statement. Reports suggest that this was no routine discussion. This was a recalibration. A moment where tradition, duty, and quiet ambition collided in a way that left even the most seasoned palace figures unsettled. At the center of that room, sources whisper, was a proposal so delicate it could not be written down, only spoken, weighed, and ultimately absorbed by those present. And for Catherine, the weight of it seemed immediate. Those familiar with palace operations describe an atmosphere that was unusually tense, even by royal standards. Aides, typically fluent in controlled messaging, were suddenly bound by what one insider described as absolute discretion. No leaks. No clarifications. Not even the usual subtle briefings that guide public understanding. It was as if the institution itself had decided to hold its breath. And in that stillness, something unmistakable began to form a shift, not just in responsibilities, but in the very architecture of royal roles. The Duchess of Edinburgh's duties, long associated with quiet consistency and unwavering loyalty, were now being reconsidered. Not publicly, not formally, but undeniably. Catherine, by all accounts, had not anticipated the gravity of what was placed before her. Different interpretations of that moment suggest she was both composed and deeply affected, caught between her instinct for duty and the unspoken implications of what accepting such a shift might mean. Because this was not merely about taking on additional engagements, it was about stepping into a space that had been carefully defined, protected, and until now, untouched. A space that belonged to Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, a figure whose quiet strength had earned her a unique place within the monarchy's inner framework. And yet, the whispers had been building for weeks. Palace administrative streams, ranging from subtle scheduling overlaps to quiet reassignments, hinted that something was already in motion long before this meeting took place. Insiders claim the decision was not spontaneous, but the culmination of a strategy unfolding beneath the surface. A strategy that required precision, patience, and above all, silence. Catherine's reaction then was not just to the proposal itself, but to the realization that the ground beneath her had already begun to shift. What made this moment even more unsettling was the absence of contradiction. No denials, no reassuring statements. Only the quiet continuation of routine, as if nothing had changed while everything had. And within that contradiction, the truth began to take shape. Because in a system built on continuity, even the smallest deviation carries meaning. And this was no small deviation. This was the kind of change that redefines roles, reshapes perceptions, and quietly redraws the lines of influence within the monarchy. But what seemed like a quiet internal adjustment was, in reality, the opening move in a far more calculated and unsettling royal strategy. The title wasn't just ceremonial, it was sacred. The Duchess of Edinburgh role, long tied to duty, discipline, and quiet service, had been entrusted to Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, as a continuation of a legacy shaped in the shadow of Queen Elizabeth II. So why was it suddenly being dismantled? To understand the weight of that question, you have to look beyond the title itself and into what it has always represented. This was never about status alone. It was about continuity, a living extension of a monarchy that prides itself on stability in a world that rarely offers any. For years, Sophie had embodied that stability quietly, consistently, without spectacle. Reports suggest she was never the loudest voice in the room, But she was often the most reliable, the one who carried out duty without deviation, who upheld expectations without seeking recognition. And in a system where loyalty is measured over decades, not moments, that kind of consistency becomes more than admirable, it becomes essential. Those familiar with royal tradition often describe roles like this as anchors, carefully positioned to ensure that the institution never drifts too far from its foundations. The Duchess of Edinburgh title was one such anchor. It carried with it not only responsibilities, but an unspoken understanding that it would remain steady, unchanged, immune to sudden shifts. Various interpretations of royal protocol suggest that such roles are rarely, if ever, reassigned without clear necessity. And yet, what was unfolding behind palace doors seemed to defy that very principle. Media insiders, including voices from publications like The Times and commentators such as Ingrid Seward, have quietly questioned the timing. Why now? Why disrupt a structure that appeared to function without friction? Some suggest that this is not about replacing Sophie, but about redefining the framework itself. Others whisper that it signals a deeper recalibration, one that prioritizes the future over the present, even if it means unsettling figures who have long been pillars of the institution. But even those explanations fail to fully account for the suddenness, the secrecy, and the absence of a clear narrative. Because what makes this moment so unsettling is not just the change, it's the implication behind it. If a role so deeply tied to continuity can be altered, then what else is subject to revision? What other traditions, once considered untouchable, are now being quietly reconsidered? The monarchy has always thrived on the illusion of permanence, on the belief that certain lines cannot be crossed. And yet, this feels like a line being redrawn in real time. For Sophie, the shift carries an emotional weight that cannot be easily dismissed. Decades of service, of quiet resilience, now intersecting with a moment that suggests even the most steadfast roles are not immune to change. Insiders whisper that this is not about failure, nor about inadequacy, but about something far more complex, a strategic evolution that demands difficult decisions and even more difficult sacrifices. And at the center of that evolution stands a figure who never sought to disrupt, yet now finds herself positioned as its symbol. Because behind the legacy and symbolism, a deeper motive was quietly taking shape, one that would place Catherine at the center of a storm she never sought. There was no announcement, no ceremony, no acknowledgement. And yet, almost overnight, responsibilities once associated with Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, began appearing on Catherine, Princess of Wales's schedule, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The shift was happening in real time, but no one dared say it out loud. At first, it looked like coincidence. A single engagement here, a patronage overlap there. The kind of minor adjustments that usually pass unnoticed in a system built on constant movement. But those familiar with palace rhythms began to notice a pattern forming beneath the surface. Reports suggest that Catherine's calendar was not just expanding, it was evolving. The nature of her appearances, the tone of her responsibilities, even the organizations she was quietly aligning with, all began to echo roles historically associated with the Duchess of Edinburgh. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It was controlled. Precise. Almost as if it had been designed to avoid detection until it was too late to question. Different interpretations of palace scheduling logs describe what insiders have cautiously referred to as a trial redistribution. Not a formal reassignment, not a public restructuring, but something far more delicate, a test of balance. A way to measure how far responsibilities could shift without triggering resistance. And for a time, it seemed to work. Because the changes were never announced, they were never challenged. They simply happened. Quietly. Methodically. One engagement at a time. But what made this shift impossible to ignore was not just Catherine's increasing presence, it was Sophie's growing absence. Engagements she would have traditionally attended were suddenly reassigned or quietly removed. Appearances that once defined her role began to fade from public view without explanation. Palace aides, when pressed, offered only vague references to private commitments, a phrase so carefully neutral it revealed nothing and yet suggested everything. Because in the monarchy, absence is never just absence. It is a signal, and this signal was being read loud and clear by those paying attention. Royal correspondents, including seasoned observers like Robert Hardman, began describing the situation in increasingly pointed terms. A silent transfer of influence. A phrase that carried weight not because of what it stated, but because of what it implied. Influence within the royal structure is not handed over lightly. It is built, protected, and rarely redistributed without consequence. And yet, here it was, shifting, almost imperceptibly, from one figure to another. Inside palace circles, the tension was no longer hidden. Those familiar with internal dynamics suggest that this was not a universally accepted move. Some viewed it as necessary evolution, aligning responsibilities with the future direction of the monarchy. Others saw it as a disruption, an unsettling break from the continuity that had long defined the institution. But no one, it seems, was willing to speak openly, because to acknowledge the shift would be to confirm it, and confirmation would demand explanation. So the silence continued, carefully maintained, strategically preserved, but beneath it, the reality was becoming impossible to ignore. Catherine was stepping into a role that had not been publicly offered. Sophie was stepping back from one she had never relinquished, and somewhere between those two movements, the monarchy was quietly redefining itself in a way that few fully understood, but many could feel. But silence, in the monarchy, is never accidental, and this silence was hiding something far more explosive than a simple reassignment. Then came the moment that made the whispers impossible to ignore. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, simply vanished from the royal spotlight. No explanation, no statement, just an absence that felt louder than any announcement ever could. At first it was subtle. A missed engagement here, a rescheduled appearance there. The kind of adjustments that, on their own, might have passed without question. But this was different. Those familiar with the cadence of royal duty began to notice the pattern almost immediately. Reports suggest that Sophie's withdrawal was not gradual, it was abrupt, deliberate, and unusually quiet. One day she was present, fulfilling the role she had carried with unwavering consistency for years. The next, she was gone from the public schedule, replaced not with explanation, but with silence. Palace officials, when pressed, offered only the most measured response: private commitments. A phrase so carefully constructed it revealed nothing, yet raised everything. Because within the monarchy, language is never accidental. Every word is chosen, every omission intentional. And this omission, this refusal to clarify, only deepened the mystery. Different interpretations of internal discussions suggest that this was not a simple matter of personal choice. Insiders whisper that there were tensions building behind closed doors, conversations that never reached the public ear but carried consequences that now could not be ignored. Media outlets began to take notice, not with headlines at first but with questions. Quiet inquiries, subtle observations. Why had Sophie stepped back so suddenly? Why now, at a moment when her role appeared more stable than ever? Commentators, including voices like Ingrid Seward, hinted that the timing felt too precise to be coincidental, that something had shifted internally, something significant enough to alter the trajectory of a figure long considered one of the monarchy's most dependable pillars. And then came the speculation. Carefully worded, cautiously framed, but impossible to ignore. Did Sophie agree to this change? Was this a voluntary step back, or the result of a decision made elsewhere? Various interpretations suggest a divide, some claiming she understood the necessity of the shift, others implying that acceptance and agreement are not always the same. Because in an institution built on hierarchy, decisions are not always collaborative. Sometimes, They are simply enacted. Perhaps the most unsettling question, however, centered on her relationship with Prince Edward. For years, they had been seen as aligned, quiet partners navigating the complexities of royal duty with a shared sense of purpose. But now, insiders began to question whether that alignment had been tested, whether this shift, this sudden absence, had introduced a strain that could not be easily dismissed. Because if Edward was indeed involved in the redistribution of responsibilities, as some reports suggest, then the implications were deeply personal as well as institutional. The absence then was not just physical, it was symbolic. A space left behind, waiting to be filled. And as that space grew more visible, so too did the figure stepping toward it. Because while Sophie faded from view, another presence was becoming impossible to ignore. A presence that carried both expectation and uncertainty in equal measure. And as Sophie stepped back, Catherine found herself stepping forward into a role that came with far more than ceremonial expectations. This was no accident. According to palace whispers, Prince Edward had been quietly orchestrating this transition for months, positioning Catherine, Princess of Wales, not just as a participant, but as a central pillar in the monarchy's next phase. For years, Edward had occupied a role that many underestimated. He was rarely the headline, rarely the focal point, yet those familiar with the inner workings of the institution often described him as something far more significant: a quiet architect, a figure who understood the fine print of royal structure better than most. Reports suggest that while others commanded attention, Edward commanded strategy. He studied patterns, anticipated shifts, and, when necessary, moved pieces without drawing attention to the movement itself. And now, insiders whisper, this was one of those moments. Not spontaneous, not reactive, but carefully constructed over time. Different interpretations of palace discussions suggest that Edward was among the first to recognize the need for recalibration. The monarchy, as it stands, is not just preserving tradition, it is preparing for transition. And within that transition lies a delicate balance between honoring the past and securing the future. Catherine, by many accounts, represents that future. Her public image, her alignment with duty, her connection to Prince William, all of it positions her as a central figure in what comes next. Strengthening her role, then, was not just an option, it was, according to some, an inevitability. But inevitability does not make the process simple. Because to elevate one role often means reshaping another. And this is where the strategy becomes complicated. Reports suggest that Edward initiated early conversations around redistributing responsibilities, framing them not as removals, but as adjustments, subtle shifts designed to align the institution with its future leadership. Yet even within those discussions, there was awareness of the implications. Because the role held by Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, was not just functional, it was symbolic. Altering it risked unsettling more than just schedules. It risked challenging perception, loyalty, and long-standing expectations. Inside palace circles, the response appears to have been far from unified. Some insiders describe the move as necessary, even overdue, a strategic realignment that ensures continuity under William's eventual reign. Others, however, question the timing. Why introduce such a shift now, when stability remains one of the monarchy's most valuable assets? Why risk internal tension for a change that, while forward-looking, disrupts a system that was still functioning? These questions, it seems, were not easily answered, and perhaps they were never meant to be. Because strategy, especially within an institution like this, is rarely about consensus. It is about direction, and Edward, by all accounts, had chosen his. A direction that placed Catherine at the forefront, not as a replacement, but as an evolution. Yet evolution, even when necessary, comes with consequences. It creates space, and in that space, uncertainty grows. For Sophie, for those aligned with her, and for the institution itself, the cost of this recalibration was beginning to take shape in ways that could not be easily contained. And as the pieces continued to move, one thing became increasingly clear. This was not just about strengthening the future, it was about redefining the present. A present where loyalty, legacy, and strategy were no longer perfectly aligned, but instead pulling in different directions, each demanding its own form of recognition. But if this was about strengthening the future, it came at a cost, one that threatened to fracture the present. She never asked for this. Yet suddenly, Catherine, Princess of Wales, was at the centre of a controversy she couldn't escape, praised by some as the monarchy's future, and quietly resented by others as the one who replaced a loyal figure. The shift, subtle at first, had now become impossible to ignore, and with it came a pressure that few could fully understand from the outside. Catherine had always been seen as a steady presence, someone who embraced duty with quiet determination rather than ambition. But now, reports suggest she was navigating something far more complex, a role that was evolving faster than anyone had anticipated, pulling her into a space filled not only with expectation, but with unspoken tension. Because stepping forward in the monarchy is never just about visibility, it's about timing. And timing, in this case, felt deeply contested. Those familiar with palace dynamics describe a growing contrast between public perception and private reality. To the world, Catherine's expanded presence appeared seamless, even natural. Her appearances were measured, her composure intact, her commitment unquestioned. But insiders whisper that behind that composed exterior was a figure acutely aware of the implications. Because every new engagement she accepted, every responsibility that quietly shifted in her direction, carried with it an unavoidable truth: she was occupying space that had not been freely given. And that awareness, according to various interpretations, weighed heavily. Catherine was not stepping into a vacant role. She was stepping into a contested one, a role long associated with Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, whose absence still lingered like an unanswered question. The comparisons, subtle at first, began to surface more openly. Media narratives, carefully framed but unmistakable, started drawing parallels between the two women, one representing continuity, the other evolution. It was not a competition, at least not officially, but the contrast was there, and it was growing. Balancing that contrast required more than composure. It required restraint. Catherine had to embody both tradition and change, to honour what came before while stepping into what was being reshaped around her. And that balance, insiders suggest, is rarely comfortable. Because in trying to satisfy both expectations, one risks fully satisfying neither. Reports hint that she approached the situation with caution, aware that any misstep, any sign of overreach or hesitation could be interpreted in ways far beyond her control. The emotional weight of that position cannot be understated. To be positioned as the future while navigating the sensitivities of the present is a delicate, often isolating experience. Catherine was no longer just fulfilling duties, she was carrying the narrative of transition itself. A narrative that others were watching closely, interpreting differently, and, in some cases, quietly resisting. Because while some viewed her expanded role as a necessary evolution, others saw it as a disruption, an uncomfortable reminder that even the most stable structures are subject to change. And within that tension, the line between success and struggle began to blur. Catherine's ability to rise to the occasion was undeniable, yet the circumstances surrounding that rise were anything but simple. Every step forward seemed to echo with the question of what or who had been left behind. And as that question lingered, so did the sense that this was no longer just about fulfilling responsibilities. It was about navigating a landscape where perception held as much power as reality. And as the pressure mounted, it became clear this wasn't just about duties anymore. It was about power, perception, and the future of the crown itself. Behind palace walls, the unity of the royal household was beginning to crack. What had once been a carefully balanced system of roles and respect was now shifting, and not everyone was willing to accept the new order. At first, the tension was subtle, almost imperceptible to those outside the inner circle. But within those circles, reports suggest the atmosphere had begun to change. Conversations that were once routine carried an edge. Decisions that would normally pass without resistance were now being quietly questioned. Because what was unfolding was not just a redistribution of duties, it was a redefinition of hierarchy. And in a structure where hierarchy is everything, even the smallest shift can trigger a ripple of uncertainty. Different interpretations from palace insiders describe a growing divide among senior figures and advisors. Some viewed Prince Edward's actions as a necessary step toward modernization, aligning the monarchy with the realities of its future under Prince William. They argued that strengthening Catherine, Princess of Wales's role was not only strategic, but essential. That the institution to survive must evolve even if that evolution comes with discomfort. But others, equally entrenched in the system, saw it differently. To them, this was not evolution. It was disruption. A break from continuity that risked undermining the very stability the monarchy depends on. And as those differing perspectives began to surface, the narrative outside the palace walls started to shift as well. Media outlets, once cautious, began amplifying the possibility of internal conflict. Not overtly, not definitively, but enough to plant the idea. Headlines hinted at division. Commentators spoke of unusual adjustments and unexpected absences. The language remained measured, but the implication was clear. Something was not aligned. Something was unfolding behind the scenes that the public was only beginning to sense. Public speculation followed quickly. A silent power struggle, some called it. A recalibration of influence, others suggested. Theories emerged, each attempting to make sense of a situation that remained deliberately opaque. But what united them all was a single underlying question: was the monarchy experiencing a moment of instability? Because for an institution built on the promise of continuity, even the perception of instability carries weight. Concerns began to grow about the long-term impact of these shifts, not just on individual roles, but on the cohesion of the royal household itself. Because unity within this system is not just symbolic, it is functional. It is what allows the institution to present a consistent image, to maintain public trust, to operate without visible fracture. And now, that unity appeared to be under strain. Not broken, not yet, but undeniably tested. The most striking aspect of this moment was not the conflict itself, but its visibility. The monarchy has long mastered the art of concealment, of managing internal tensions without allowing them to surface. And yet, this felt different. The signs, subtle but persistent, were becoming harder to ignore. The absence of Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, the rise of Catherine, the strategic movements attributed to Edward, all of it converging into a narrative that suggested more than simple adjustment. It suggested transformation. And transformation, especially within an institution so deeply rooted in tradition, is rarely smooth. It challenges expectations, it unsettles loyalties, it forces choices that cannot be undone. The monarchy, it seemed, was entering a phase where the balance between past and future was no longer stable, but shifting actively, visibly, and with consequences that were only beginning to unfold. Because when tradition is challenged, the consequences don't just ripple, they reshape everything. What began as a whisper had become a defining moment. The reassignment of duties wasn't just a personnel change, it was a signal. A warning. A glimpse into the monarchy's future, where legacy and evolution collide in ways no one can fully control. And now, as the dust begins to settle at least on the surface, the true weight of what has unfolded starts to reveal itself. Because this was never just about shifting responsibilities from one royal to another. It was about redefining who carries the future of the institution, and at what cost. Catherine, Princess of Wales, now stands in a position that extends far beyond expectation. Reports suggest her expanded role is not temporary. not experimental, but part of a long-term vision that places her at the very core of what the monarchy is becoming. A future built not only on continuity, but on calculated transformation. But every transformation leaves something behind. And in this case, that absence carries a name. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, once a quiet pillar of consistency, now occupies a space that feels uncertain, undefined. Different interpretations suggest her role is not erased, but altered, shifted into something less visible, less central. Yet within the monarchy, visibility is influence. And influence, once adjusted, is rarely returned in its original form. The question that lingers is not whether Sophie remains within the institution, but what her place within it now truly means. Then there is Prince Edward, a figure whose actions, whether viewed as strategic foresight or disruptive intervention, have reshaped the narrative in ways that cannot be undone. Some see him as the architect of necessary change, a quiet strategist who recognized the inevitability of transition and acted before it was too late. Others view his role with more caution, suggesting that even the most calculated decisions carry unintended consequences. Because in attempting to secure the future, one risks destabilizing the present. And that balance between foresight and disruption may ultimately define how his legacy is remembered. The monarchy itself now stands at a crossroads shaped not by external pressure, but by internal choice. Adapting under pressure has always been part of its survival, but adaptation of this magnitude carries deeper implications. Public trust, carefully maintained over generations, is not built solely on tradition, it is built on perception. And perception, once shaken, does not easily settle. The narrative surrounding this shift has already begun to influence how the institution is viewed, how its decisions are interpreted, and how its future is imagined. Because beneath all the analysis, all the speculation, one question continues to echo: was this necessary? Or was it avoidable? Was this a bold step toward securing the monarchy's future, or a risk that introduced fractures where stability once stood? There is no clear answer, not yet. Only the understanding that what has been set in motion will continue to unfold, shaping relationships, roles, and reputations in ways that extend far beyond this moment. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. That in seeking to preserve legacy, the monarchy has altered it. That in strengthening one path forward, it has closed another. And that the consequences of this decision, quiet as it began, will resonate long after the silence that once concealed it has faded. Because in the House of Windsor, nothing is ever just a role, it's a legacy. And legacies once altered are never easily restored. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.